Okay, so maybe not everything that you say about combat is incorrect. I owe you an apology. Hey, look, don't rub it in. You still call a longsword a one-handed weapon, so screw you!
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I am Shad, and it turns out that role-playing games, not just indie, might have actually got something correct. And it's in regards to how they treat using a weapon in one hand versus two-hand, specifically about the damage bonus. Someone might have done it before, but this is a more recent test that was being done by Wushu Engineer, where he specifically tests impact force for a weapon in one hand, like so striking with a weapon in one hand versus striking with it in two hands. He was actually doing it in response to one of my videos. What video was that? The nunchucks! You thought this was not going to be a nunchuck video, but it is, so yeah, we're going to talk about that nunchucks and crap on them. Not completely about the nunchucks, but okay, hear me out. I have long said that according to just the laws of physics, because of the flexible link and its ability to transfer full, kinetic energy, specifically the extra mass that you can throw into a strike, that nunchucks will never be able to hit as hard as a stick of equivalent length and very, close enough to the same mass. Now don't worry, this isn't going to be a huge nunchuck rant, alright? This is the point of reference that we can now take to inform us how using any weapon in one-handed versus two-hand actually could work and kind of apply it into role-playing game fantasy and everything like that. But this is where it came from, because in my most recent and last video I did on this subject, I go into the physics a lot more, and one of the main points that I say in that, which a lot of people seem to avoid in the testing, is two-hand striking with nunchucks versus two-hand striking with a stick. And that people seem to just intuitively know that a two-handed strike with nunchucks are not actually going to increase the damage that much, which is why barely anyone ever does it. Nunchuck seems to be a very sole one-handed weapon. Now, I personally think there's even still advantage with one-handed strikes on a stick, but when we compare the damage increase that you can achieve when using a weapon with two hands versus one-handed, well, Wushu Engineer took up that challenge and he's made a brilliant video. Link in the description. I'll put it there as a card as well. Go check out his video. Really in-depth, and I'm just kind of going to summarize it. And he doesn't have horse in the race. He likes the nunchucks. By the way, nunchucks are fun. I've always been just criticizing the over-exaggerated effectiveness of them, and also comparing them against other weapons. And I meme on it because people get very attached and offended, and so, hey, if you're going to get so, involved in it, I'll have some fun with it. But if they have trouble competing with a weapon as humble as the stick, okay, then how good is it really? Because the stick is one of the lower tier weapons you can find. But in his video, he tested strikes with nunchucks versus stick in one hand, the difference, and what was interesting, the stick was a little bit higher in this test. They were pretty close, though, in one-handed striking, but then he went to two-hand strikes, so he'll do a two-handed strike with nunchucks, you get to see it in the video, and then two-hand striking with a stick to see the difference in damage compared to not only the one-handed strikes, but also between the two weapons. The results were very eye-opening, also really interesting because it actually paralleled what's in certain role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Using two hands on a stick increased the impact force by 50%, all right? Not double, but 50%. Interestingly, when he used two hands on nunchucks, there was only a marginal difference in damage. Nunchucks barely got any actual full advantage in using two hands on them versus a stick. Which, look, that does confirm what I've been saying for a long time, that nunchucks in particular have a massive limitation in being able to transfer momentum, additional mass, and when you throw as much power as you can into a strike, because of the flexible link, you're actually only hitting with the mass of this thing. There's no kinetic chain here to help you drive the force home, which I've been saying from the very beginning of my whole nunchuck saga. So yes, that does confirm what I've been saying, but that's actually a side point to what I really want to dive into, and that's the actual kind of confirmation of many role-playing games of the increase in force that you get when you use two hands on a weapon versus one. So in Dungeons & Dragons, and I don't know when this rule actually came in. I know it's in 3rd edition and 3.5, that's my favorite. I haven't tried out 5th edition, but I suspect that this rule still plays into effect, that your character has a strength score. Let's go to the top end. Say you had 18 strength, which gives you a +4 bonus to attack and damage. They might have changed the conversion, but that's what it was in 3.5. Now, that's with any weapon. But when you use a weapon in 2 hands, what you can actually do is you can add 50% of that bonus rounded down in addition to your standard strength bonus. So if I had a +4 when I use a weapon in 2 hands, I actually now get a +6. So half your normal bonus added on top. And it turns out in real world tests, as we saw in Wushu Engineer's video, that's pretty accurate. That's basically, yes, that's what happens when you use a weapon in 2 hands. Extra leverage, and just these points of leverage, see here, you're literally making an additional point of leverage, okay? See, one here, right there. That's by pulling it in, you're able to push down further and put more of your weight and power into a strike. Some people might have assumed that it would double the impact force, but no, it's about 50%. And D&D got that right. This is a good rule because it reflects reality. So I'd love it to see it implemented in everything, in video games and stuff like that. 2 hands increases damage by 50% of the base average. What about shorter weapons though? Because these are made to be used with 1 hand. Is it appropriate to get the 50% bonus in weapons that are even lighter? And yeah, absolutely, because of the leverage, just the additional leverage, even though this is smaller, made to be used 1 hand, that extra leverage point that you grab right here, seriously, you can just exert more force by applying more of your own body's mass. That creates a stronger kinetic link to be able to push a strike in. So yes, short weapons should definitely still get the 50% strength bonus on top of the regular bonus. Well, what about going further than just short weapons, small weapons like daggers and everything? So I have a video that actually explores the fact that weapons like daggers can easily do as much damage as spears and everything like that. And depending on how they're used, so if you use 2 hands in a thrust to be able to push it in, I think it's appropriate to get the additional 50%. It's interesting, it's a smaller lever, so when you grab it here, knives aren't necessarily great cutters. Depends on the type of knife. You can get cleaver knives that are insane cutters. And so I think in most cases, yeah, you could still get the 50% bonus with knives if you 2-handed, but knives should almost get an additional bonus for how maneuverable they are in close quarters because they're so short. Like knives, it's so much easier to get into specific angles and directions and stuff, which make them very, very useful. And of course, we see that reflected in history. When people are grappling up close, oftentimes they need to drop the large weapon, pull out a knife, and then do something like that. That's how a lot of armored knights are actually defeated. They're so protected in their armor that one of the more effective ways to incapacitate them is to grapple, knock them down off their feet, and then get a knife and jab it somewhere where you might be able to stick a pointy blade through. Looking at properly, 2-handed swords now, and 2-handed weapons in general, this is made to be used in 2 hands. You can see it. It's pretty clear and obvious. Thing is, though, you can use a longsword, 1 hand quite effectively. It's actually not super cumbersome. This one is a particularly nice longsword, very well balanced, and so as a result, it's far more nimble than you might think in 1 hand. And so, as a result, I think you could get away with using longswords in role-playing games and stuff, because you can kind of get away with it in real life without too much of a disadvantage. And if you want to push it, maybe you could give a -1 to attack, but you'll get the advantages on reaches. Maybe they say the reach advantages appears in the damage statistics and things. Because the reality is, even though this is very usable in 1 hand still, it's not necessarily as nimble as a 1-handed sword, depending on the type. Because again, this is a very well balanced and light longsword, where it's just like a beautiful mid-range. I love this longsword. And so in terms of it's only the slightest bit more cumbersome in 1 hand than the actual 1-handed sword. But then we get to much bigger 2-handed swords, and this is what I like to call a war sword, but for most intents and purposes, for D&D systems and everything, that people would assume this falls into the greatsword category. From the ground, comes up to about here. It's a nice big one, but the thing is, if you're like me and you know the historical references, actual greatswords could come in much bigger sizes. We're talking head height. And there's a big difference between this size and head height, like proper greatswords. These are Zweihanders, Montantes, even Flambergs and things. Okay, so historically, greatswords even bigger, which is why I like the warsword category, and most role-playing games don't even have warsword as its own category. It just goes longsword, greatsword. And then, and so, yeah, in statistics, most often they would just consider this a greatsword in D&D. And there's lots of swords that actually fall into this kind of size range of sword, like claymores. People always think claymores are great swords, but actually, a lot of claymores, they're about, you know, size of a war sword. So, when it comes to two-handed swords that are more kind of dedicated and specifically two-handed, like this, all right, using this in one hand is actually possible. You could, you know, I'm on the green screen, so I got to be careful. You could like get swings in one-handed. It's not impossible. And if you had extra strength, you could handle it. And so what I would do for role-playing and things, I'd almost have an attack penalty for someone unless they have particularly high strength in trying to use a two-handed sword like this in one hand. This is different to a longsword, okay? This is bigger. I know in certain expansion, depending on, you know, what version of D&D you play, there was an expansion module that had a feat called Monkey Grip, which enabled you to just get trained and use two-handed swords like this in one hand. And so, walking around just one-handed, you know, big sword, like, oh, that looks cool. Sometimes they account for it, granted. But if not, it would make sense to actually have a penalty when trying to use such a big weapon like this in one hand, because you don't nearly have as much leverage to get away with using it. Because this sword requires more strength to wield properly, should you then get the additional 50% bonus of damage on top of it because using two hands? Yes, absolutely, I still think you should, because even when using one hand, all right, you're able to put all your weight and strength into the strike from the one hand, and so whatever bonus you were able to put into a one-handed sword using one hand, you could exert that same amount of force and effort into even a larger one. It just takes more strength to do, but absolutely. And then, of course, when you use it in two hands, you get the same, you know, advantage of this leverage point, and so 50% bonus on top makes complete sense. Let's keep it the way it is. But there are some weapons that would be particularly cumbersome to use in one hand, and I think it would make sense to have an appropriate penalty as a result. And that is polearms, but not all polearms, because spears absolutely have been able to be used in one hand throughout history, and so no penalty with spears. But when it comes to something particularly top-heavy, like a halberd or a poleaxe, these are basically dedicated two-handed weapons. You could try and use it in like one hand, you know, where you can like couch it and swing it across and things and get some measure of use out of it. So I think you should, you know, the players should be allowed to try. It should just come with an appropriate penalty, like a -2 to attack or something like that, or even more. And this applies to other particularly cumbersome weapons, dedicated two-hand weapons like Vector Corbin and other things as well. But definitely, when using two hands, the strength bonus that is more common in role-playing games, 50% on top of the regular one, fits really well. So look, this is a really interesting little exploration that's confirmed now by real-world tests from Wushu Engineer, and just interesting seeing how it applies more broadly to role-playing games and everything like that. And nunchucks suck. Okay, I'm only doing it to trigger people now, all right? They're fun. If you enjoy it, go to town. Glad you like them. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have enjoyed, and of course, hope to see you again on the next video on Shadowversity. So until that time, farewell.